So I will be introducing James Joseph Bede. He's a sociologist who is interested in sexuality, gender, race, and inequalities. In addition to his book, he has written a number of articles and book chapters on topics such as lesbian, gay, and queer film, intersectionality, and the politics of sexual identities, and the cultural politics of lesbian and gay social movements. His new research investigates the changing sexual identity and community dynamics among straight and gay residents of the Castro District in San Francisco. This project builds on his past work to look at the identity and community politics of straight and LGBTQ sexuality through the lens of changing urban gay enclaves. Dean grew up in 29 Palms, California, a small town in the high desert of Southern California. He received his BA from Pomona College in Fremont, California, along with a new research for the savings and mascot, the number 47, their lucky number, and their often having 10. From Southern California, he moved across the country to upstate New York, earning his PhD in sociology at SUNY Albany, where he came to appreciate the winter he once had taken for only a fashionable attire. In 2005, he happily returned to California and began working at Sonoma State and became chair of sociology department. He currently resides in San Francisco, so please give a warm round of applause to James.
Thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. I'm happy to talk to you today. I was talking to my boyfriend last night, and I told him that I was giving this talk and that I normally do not talk about myself in personal terms. So my sociology classes, I teach sociology of sexualities and gender. We'll read books and articles, and we talk about the books and articles. And as it is relevant, one may talk about their personal life, but I'm going to break that rule today. So I'll start with sociological concepts that I think are about social identity, about myself and my own identities, as well as about how to understand others. So one of the ideas that I think is critical to developing your own identity and understanding others is figuring out where your passions are in college. So whether that passion is for sociology, or whether that passion is for English, or whether that passion is for science, technology, engineering, mathematics, which is now referred to as STEM. I think finding your passion and connecting it to a major is really valuable, and that's what I did as an undergraduate. I think of the university as sort of a microcosm of the world. It's a microcosm of the world in the sense that on one hand you have the social sciences that try to help people, right? Anthropology studies other cultures, sociology studies its own society. You have the sciences which study the physical world of chemistry or biology, and then you have the humanities that try to understand the arts or literature, right? So that's a lot to choose from, and that's a pretty rich world, and I think one would be hard-pressed to find a better place to find yourself than the university, right? Where you can choose from all these majors and really go into these majors and then take them and make them an occupation, a job, a career that you really care about. So I think that on one hand, it's about being honest about who you are and finding your own identity. And on the other hand, it's learning to listen to others. So I think, my dad doesn't listen very well to me. Like he built a basketball court in our backyard when I was growing up, but he never played basketball with me. So I never liked basketball. So I chose a sport that he didn't play, tennis, and that was more fun because I was better at it than he was. I think in contrast, my mom did really listen to me, right? And my mom was a community college professor in 29 Palms and Palm Springs at College of the Desert, if you know Palm Desert. And she taught history, and she was always interested in the real world and what the real world is like, not novels. And I think similarly, I chose sociology as an undergraduate because I was interested in the real world and I didn't want to read novels and fictional accounts about it. So let me start with my sociology, and then I'll go back to the personal, and I have a couple of pictures. So in sociology, there's two big concepts in Sociology 101. So if you've taken Intro to Sociology, I apologize. But two big concepts. One is social roles, and the other is social identity. So what is a social role? The easiest way to understand the concept is to think of an example. So a social role, for example, would be that you're a son or a daughter, which is true for all of you. You would be a co-worker at work, right? So a social role, the formal definition would be, is one's expected role or position within an organization or institution. So within the family, you're a son or daughter, maybe you're a father or a mother, right? That would be your position within the institution of the family. Similarly, when I come to the university, I'm a professor. When I go home, I no longer act like a professor, at least not on purpose, right? My brother does say that I lecture him, so, that's a different kind of professorial role. So social roles are seen as sort of constrained to the institution. So when you're with your family, you're a son or daughter. When you're at work, you're a co-worker. But social identities are the ways that we personally, individually identify ourselves, as well as how we define ourselves as belonging to collective groups. So for example, if you think of yourself as a girl or a woman, that probably persists across whether you're with your family, or whether you're at work, or whether you're with your friends. Similarly, a social identity like being black also persists whether you're at work, with your family, or with your friends, right? So social identities are more constant, and they sort of organize our lives across social institutions. But your social role could become an identity. So for a lot of people will talk about moms who are super moms, and being a super mom seems to be less a role and more an identity, right? But yet that identity will go away typically when their kid goes to school, like college, right? So supermom feels a little empty nest syndrome once her daughter or son has gone away to college because, well, there's no one at home to supermom anymore, right? So identities and roles do add and subtract, right? Right now, you're beginning to be trained to be college graduates and thus professionals. You are a minority in America. Only 38% of Americans have a college degree or higher. So that means 62% of Americans have a high school diploma or less, right? We have about a 10% dropout rate in the US for high school dropouts, right? So 10% of Americans never even get a high school diploma. So going on that, right, I think one of the ways that we can think about social identity is that we can use our identity to understand other people. And I think you can use the identity to understand other people because identity is always multiple and variable. And I think on one hand, people resent the analogy that you can understand someone else's experiences through your own experience. Yet, I think that's true. I think there's a limit on both ways, but I still think it's true. So what I mean by that is I think, for example, maybe a woman can empathize and understand a black man's experience through her own experiences with sexism, right? Or maybe a gay man could understand how women must deal with sexism. Or, maybe someone who has grown up as an undocumented immigrant in the US can understand what it's like to be gay, because living in the shadows of a society where you're not documented might be like living in the shadow of the closet before you came out as gay, right? So I think in many ways, minorities and various people can draw on their social identity to understand another person's identity. Of course, you have to choose to do that, right? So that's always a big deal. So one way that I think about social identity and then forms of racism, homophobia, sexism, social class inequality, etc., is that we should think about the idea of social oppression as different from privilege, right? So maybe you grew up working class, but you become a doctor and you make a lot of money. Well, you don't have the same sort of working class status once you're a doctor making 6 figures. So you might have social class privilege later in life that you didn't at the beginning of your life. So privilege for me is distinct from prejudice. So in sociology, we would say that prejudice is a negative attitude. So for example, if you think women are inferior to men, or they should be subordinate and submissive, that's a sort of prejudicial attitude towards women, right? So prejudice in sociology we talk about as an attitude. The difference between prejudice and discrimination is that discrimination has to be an act that would exclude women from some resource, right? So discrimination would mean that women are being excluded from, say, becoming doctors or lawyers, or women are excluded from golf clubs, which is still true, right? Some golf resorts are still provinces of men. So I think that's an important distinction because I think we all have various forms of privilege, right? And for me, privilege just means an unearned advantage, right? So you get something by virtue of a status that you did not earn. So for example, a lot of people would probably agree that if you're attractive, people will cater to you, right? So that beautiful girls and beautiful women will get more things than non-beautiful girls and women, right? So attractive people get privilege just by virtue of being attractive. Yet they didn't do anything for that, right? They were just, by virtue of our culture, designated as attractive, right? I think the other way that we think about privilege is the way in which, say, men get catered to, right? So that male privilege means that men might be viewed as better leaders just by virtue of being male, right? And so men thus tend to be the ones who occupy leadership positions, right? That would be another example, right? So I think though we should separate out privilege, which is this unearned advantage, from prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory acts, right? And that being honest about our identity will mean being honest about where we have privilege and where we don't, right? And if we're honest about our privilege, I think we can also sort of then rethink how prejudice or discrimination comes out. I think that in many ways, discrimination has, of course, persisted. It persists in more subtle ways today, but prejudice is probably the more common thing that we talk about and think about in college situations and on college campuses. So what I mean by that is whether it's terms like faggot or whether it's terms like cunt, you know, I think that kind of language, or maybe how people will use the term ghetto so loosely, right, is indicative of more prejudicial attitudes, right? I can see in my sociology of race and ethnicity class that a lot of students will say, oh, you know, that's so ghetto. And they don't mean a neighborhood in a city that's populated by poor working class black and white Latino people. They mean that their car is old and it's ghetto, right? So they use ghetto in this really loose way, yet ghetto can refer to, you know, a particular set of experiences that are not their own, right? And so I think that can be read as insensitive. It can be read as a form of privilege. You know, you grew up in the suburbs, not the, quote, ghetto of Oakland, right? Or the ghetto of LA. And so you can say the word ghetto in a sort of unconscious, unthoughtful, sort of callous way. I think the term, and it's talked about in your reading, it's a useful term because I do think it captures what happens on college campuses, which is microaggressions, right? So, you know, some of my black female students have said that, you know, people will comment on their hair, people will comment to them that, oh, you're majoring in biology, are you going to do the BA or the BS? And as a black female student, the instructor was assuming that the student would choose the BA route because it's easier than the BS route. Well, that student might feel that that's sort of a slight or a microaggression against her because she's a black woman and blackness is maybe seen as less intellectual, less smart than whiteness in our society. So I think that term is useful. Micro because it's small, and aggression because, in part, even if it's not meant to be actively aggressive, it sort of does become at least passively aggressive because you're putting someone in a box or a stereotype that is disrespectful of them, right? And I think that's where listening can, you know, really become useful because a lot of people say things and do things without thinking about them. A lot of students will also try to sort of paper over when they get their feelings hurt, and as if it's wrong to have feelings, right? So I hear expressions like, I'm butthurt, or he's butthurt, as if it's not okay to be hurt, right? And say, oh, you know, actually what you said did hurt my feelings. I don't appreciate when you say this to me, whatever it might be. Or I think the other way that people sort of try to ignore the way that things happen is that, you know, they dismiss it as a joke. Right? Somehow, if it's a joke, then it should be okay. Why are jokes okay? Maybe jokes aren't okay, right? Maybe some jokes are funny, maybe some jokes aren't. My point, though, is that in this world, we get to complain about everything. That doesn't mean you get to call someone an asshole because they told a joke you didn't like, but it does mean that you can say, oh, I didn't think your joke was funny, right? I think that's what listening is about. Listening is about listening to someone else's complaint and them complaining about you, right? And you being able to own up to that complaint that they have of you. You know, students will complain that I'm too strict, or students will complain that I require too many response papers and that they can read on their own. And, you know, I hear that complaint, but I'm not going to change. You know, other times I will change, right? Students will say, oh, you talk too much when we're having a quiz. Please don't talk when we're having a quiz. We can't focus. I stop talking. That was a good complaint, right? So I think, you know, we all have to figure out, you know, where we fall. Some complaints are more systematic than others, and I think what the term microaggression is trying to do is trying to alert us to how minority students, gay students, female students, students who aren't in sororities and fraternities feel excluded, feel that there's passive-aggressive acts put onto them, and so on, right? So one of the things I like, one of the people I like, it's not very politically correct and it's not very in fashion, but I very much admire Sigmund Freud. That might be weird because Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis is said to have viewed homosexuality as a form of arrested psychological development and as less healthy than heterosexuality. That's in part true. Psychoanalysis and Freud did think that. Freud, though, did not think you could change someone's sexuality, and he wrote to a mother who wrote to him about her gay son, and he responded that one should not try to change one's child's sexuality, that there had been many historical figures like Microaggression who had been known to engage in homosexuality and so on and so forth. Why do I like psychoanalysis? I like psychoanalysis because psychoanalysis says that you should listen. And how does it say you should listen? It says you should listen in a very interesting way. So it says that when you say something to someone, you should listen to how they listened to what you said to them. That is, there's a lot of miscommunication. And when someone says something to you, you might say something back to them that really wasn't what they were talking about. But if you listen to how they listen to your statement or your question, then that offers you a new interpretation of how they are thinking. Does that make sense to you? So it's about listening to listening, right? And I think that's actually quite insightful, quite powerful, and quite difficult, right? Quite difficult. Because I think a lot of people don't like listening because, I don't know, various reasons. I think my father just never learned to listen because, I don't know, his parents weren't very good listeners. That would be my take. So that's pretty Freudian too. But I think psychoanalysis says that we should listen, and that oftentimes the way we need to learn to listen to others is by realizing that when we get emotional, a lot of the things that we say and think about others are things that we think and say about ourselves, right? That would be projection. And a lot of the things that we internalize and take into others from others is sort of introjection. So if you often say that your friend Adam or your friend Jennifer is really judgmental, you might want to stop, pause, and think, are you really judgmental, just like Adam? Or are you really judgmental, just like Jennifer? That's a really common projection, right? Similarly, a lot of people admire athletes, right? Steph Curry, for example, and the Warriors are in the news all the time, right? They admire his poise, his skill, his grace, his sportsmanship, and all those things. Well, might it be that you also have poise, grace, good sportsmanship, and so on? Might it be that you're interjecting and taking in the qualities that Steph Curry embodies that you also embody, whether it's on the basketball court, or whether it's in a classroom, or whether it's as a friend, right? So I think, that way, if you learn to think about projection and introjection, then you have learned to think about things psychoanalytically, right? And in sociology and in social theory, I teach a sort of psychoanalytic sociology. There is a tradition of that within sociology. So you can take theory with me and I'll teach you. All right. So this is my other point, and I think this is a good psychoanalytic point. I think we should all try to be understanding to others, but that doesn't mean that we have to agree with them totally. So we can agree with 50%, 60%, 70%, whatever percent. So you can agree in part with someone else, but you don't have to agree totally. And so my point is that I would never deny someone else's truth, but I don't have to agree with what they said 100% or wholesale, right? Understanding can be ambivalent. You can agree with part, and you can disagree with another part. right? And I think that's an important thing. You don't have to agree with someone in totality. Moreover, right, I would say that one of the things you learn as an adult is that everything has its advantages and disadvantages. Every person, every major, every occupation, every choice. Every choice has advantages and disadvantages. And to that extent, of course you want to make the choice that is least ambivalent, right? That you feel most sure about. But even if you feel so sure about that choice, it still doesn't mean it doesn't have disadvantages, right? And I just think, that's a useful, way to realize things happen. Okay, so personal. I grew up in a small military town by Palm Springs. It's called 29 Palms. It's a really homophobic town because it's based on a population that comes from military Marine base. And I wanted to I wanted to leave 29 Palms as fast as I could. So, when I was applying to colleges, I'm from California, I wanted to stay in California, I sought a very liberal college. So I went to college outside LA, and I picked a college that had sexual orientation as part of its non-discriminatory clause. And I think that one of the ways that I became a leader was by finding a college where I could be out as gay. And I joined the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Student Union there, the LGBSU. I joined the Queer Resource Center there. I would organize Coming Out Week. I would organize lecture series by professors on different events regarding LGBTQ issues, right? So I think I worked through being gay in part by choosing sociology, in part by becoming a leader in student organizations. For me, I've always felt comfortable with racial ethnic minorities. My mom is Mexican American, so, she has a sense of her Mexicanness that was strong. My father's white, hence my last name, Dean. And my father doesn't have an ethnic identity. He's not Irish or Italian. He's from Florida, so he likes the Dallas Cowboys and the South, right? So he's more a Southern identity. So I think in high school, all my friends were straight women, and that I felt straight women were less homophobic than straight men, right? And I, in part, chose a major that was about racial politics, gender politics, and then, gay, lesbian identity politics. So on the left is 29 Palms. That's what it looks like. That's my backyard. It's a very small town. Joshua Tree National Park is there, so if you go to Joshua Tree, that's quite nice. It's much nicer than the people I went to high school with. And then on the right is Pomona College in Claremont, so it's just outside LA, so it's 30 minutes from LA. And it's sort of like here, it's a small liberal arts college. It's very pretty, and I was walking around today and it's like, oh, Sonoma is so pretty. All the hills, the campus, it's a beautiful campus. Not all campuses are this beautiful. I went to grad school in upstate New York at SUNY Albany, and that was a really ugly campus. So don't think you're always going to be on a pretty campus, So what did I do in undergrad? In undergrad, I majored in sociology, and I majored in women's and gender studies. I think I picked sociology because I was interested in all those issues around race, social class, gender identity, and then my own sexuality. So I started in '93, and then I had to do an undergraduate thesis. And in the 90s, 92, Bill Clinton was elected, but before Bill Clinton, there was George Bush, Ronald Reagan had 2 terms, right? So there had been 12 years of Republican-led presidential administrations. Well, during the 1980s, right, so it's before me, but it's the age that I come up in, was the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right? So HIV/AIDS epidemic is a huge deal, especially in places like San Francisco, New York, and across the country. Well, it primarily affected gay populations, and there were lots of gay men dying. As a result of like all these gay men dying, and the result that really not until 91 and 92 were there effective drug treatments, social movements formed in reaction to the lack of governmental support for HIV and AIDS infected individuals, right? And a lot of the people who formed these groups were gay men, along with straight women in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. So, you know, I decided to do an undergraduate thesis on ACT UP, which is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and Queer Nation in Los Angeles. So, you know, I don't think that it's surprising that, you know, I was really angry, you know, and I'm still veritably angry at my high school classmates for the way in which I was bullied and called names like faggot, you know, both in junior high and high school. And I think I took that anger and I took it to college and I worked through it by in part joining these organizations like LGBTQ, you know, as well as by doing an undergraduate thesis about a group, a social movement that was angry at how gay men were being discriminated against for getting HIV and contracting that disease. So, you know, the social movement was filled with gay men who were angry, and that really allowed me to connect my anger as having been taunted, you know, through all these homophobic epithets, you know, faggot, in high school. And so I connected my anger to studying this social movement that was about anger against gay prejudice and discrimination around HIV/AIDS. So I think the thing that I think about anger is that everyone gets angry. And anger is useful in the sense that it tells us that someone is infringing upon us and perhaps disrespecting us and those kinds of things. So I think on one hand, anger allows you to be separate, right? And on the other, and furthermore, not only does it allow you to be separate and to see things clearly, but it allows you to call out issues of injustice, unfairness, mistreatment, disrespect, misrecognition, and so on, right? So I think that's the good part of anger, right? It gives you some clarity around inequality. I think the downside of anger, at least for me personally, has been that I can fly off the handle. I can yell like my father. I can make really mean, nasty, scary faces like my dad did to me. And then the issue about inequality or unfairness or how I felt slighted no longer becomes the issue. What becomes the issue is that I have anger management problems, that I'm flying off the handle, and that I'm destroying relationships with people that I care about, right? Or with people that I want to maintain a relationship with. So instead of calling my friend out on what he said to me, I end up blowing up at him, and the issue becomes how I blew up and lost control, as opposed to the thing he said that made me angry that was out of line, right? So I think that anger is not a bad emotion. Anger is something that we all have, but it is something that you have to learn, at least if you're like me, to control and talk about in a less defensive way, so that way you can be heard and not make the issue about your anger, but the issue really about how you felt slighted or disrespected along those things, right? I went to graduate school in upstate New York. I also struggled to find a topic to write about. I've always found talking and presenting and teaching to be easier. My mom, my dad, my brother, my uncle, my grandfather are all teachers, so that's pretty easy for me. Not that it's not work, but it's not hard work. I do find writing difficult, and for a PhD you have to write a dissertation. A dissertation is 200 to 300 pages in length, and it's a long project. So when I was trying to figure out a dissertation topic, I looked at my own identity and I looked at the discipline of sociology. And I ended up studying black and white straight men and women, and I interviewed homophobic black and white straight men and women, and I also interviewed gay-friendly and pro-gay black and white straight men and women. And in part, this study captured my own life, right? Because 29 Palms had been this place that was a bastion of homophobia, and Pomona College and then SUNY Albany, my undergrad and graduate schools, had been places that were bastions of gay friendliness, gay lesbian allies for me, and so on. And so the dissertation I wrote ended up becoming a book, and as a sociologist, my goal as a sociologist was to contribute to my discipline. Well, the discipline had been moving toward, in gender, going from studying women to studying men. In race, it had gone from studying Latinos, blacks, and Asians to studying whites. And then a similar move was open to be made from studying gays and lesbians to studying straights and heterosexuality, right? And that's what my book and my dissertation did. So I think what I like about writing is that it's allowed me to capture the complexity of my thought and really take my critical thinking to its most sophisticated level possible. I think that's really the value of writing. Your most original thought happens through writing. And in part it happens through writing because you're allowed to rewrite it. Right? It's a lot of work, but that challenge has been rewarding, at least for me. So on the left is a picture of an ACT UP demonstration. They popularized silence equals death, and on the left is silence equals death, ACT UP, and on the right is my book that came out 2 years ago. So I'm really proud of it. And a lot of colleges and university classes in sociology are using it, whether it's at Brandeis University in Boston or Northwestern in Chicago. And it's been so popular that there's a second printing of the book coming out this fall. So I'm super proud of that. And so I guess what I wanted to say to you, and you can ask me questions, and I'll end with this, is that when I was in grad school and before I went to therapy in San Francisco when I moved here, there was a book by a Buddhist American teacher that I found. It was called A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield. And Jack Kornfield actually has Spirit Rock here in Marin County. I think that in many ways, through the friends that I had in college, I used the title of his book really to pick my major, right? I picked a path or a major that connected to my passions in the world, right? And that really brought both my mind as well as my heart together. I think similarly, that's how I chose to major in sociology, and I might recommend it to you. Go through the course catalog and see which major has the most interesting classes to you, and pick that as your major, right? That's how I picked sociology. The same thing is true about how I picked my dissertation and book topic. I examined my own personal life as well as what I had been reading in sociology. So as an undergrad, I had read about the sociology of whites and whiteness. I had read about the sociology of men and masculinity. So I knew that that was a way to go forward within sociology that combined my personal interests as well as where the discipline of sociology was going. So I brought them together. I think I'm really fortunate that way, but I don't think I'm the only one who's fortunate. My brother teaches in Boyle Heights in LA, and he very much enjoys being a high school English teacher. And so I think he brings his passion to his job, just like I bring my passion to my job. And, I think, my ex-boyfriend, he is a city planner. I think he brings his passion in geography and geology to city planning. And when we would drive to LA, he would, point out the aqueduct that runs along the 5, which I never noticed. And he has a lot of passion about planning and maps and things like that. And I think one can bring their passion to whatever they choose, but you do have to think about your passions, think about your interests as you choose your major, as you choose the kinds of jobs you might want to explore. So what would I recommend? I would recommend the same thing for you. I would recommend that you think about where your passions lie and where your academic intellectual interests come from, and bring those two together as you choose a major, as well as how you choose to understand others. Understand your own social roles and your own social identities. And I think it's through, reading a book, watching a movie, that we learn to understand other individuals. And I do think by understanding another person's identity, we learn to understand ourselves. And as a result, I think the effort at listening to and understanding others is as much a benefit to that person as it is to us, right? So, not surprising as a sociologist, I would say that social life and society is about everyday social interactions, and your ability to understand another person is also an ability to understand yourself, right? And I think that's really rewarding. All right, so that's all I have for you.